Right. Well, yeah, thanks for having me. Excited to be here and excited to talk about this topic. I think it's a hot one right now, and hearing a lot of questions about it. I think a lot of people are thinking about this topic, so it's pretty timely. Um, yeah, the topic that we're going to discuss a little bit today is making onshore offshore team decisions in a down economy. And I've done a flavor of this talk before, but I think it's even more relevant now because people are putting greater scrutiny on how they staff product teams, how they configure product teams, how they go about pursuing some of these digital innovation efforts. And, now more than ever, it's really important to make sure that you're achieving your goals, but you're doing that in a way that is as cost effective as possible. And so hope you guys like the topic. As Mamta mentioned, I'd really like to encourage you all to ask questions along the way. You're not gonna interrupt my flow or anything. I tend to do a good job of that on my own, so don't worry about it. Throwing questions into the Q&A window or into the chat, and we'll pick those up along the way. And then we'll also have a Q&A session towards the end of this for any other questions that kind of come in along the way. But our goal is to really give a lot of value to you guys, and hopefully you walk away from this brief webinar with some new knowledge or approaches, or at least something to think about as you're trying to make some of these decisions. Before I dive in, I'll just give you a little bit of additional background on me. As Mamta mentioned, my name's Jeff Francis. I live here in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. I'm one of the co-founders of N08, and we're a Inc. 5000 digital innovation studio. And just personally, I've worked with probably over a couple hundred different product launches. Do a whole lot of stuff with startups, but I've also worked with a lot of enterprises in extending, improving, or completely reimagining products that they're trying to launch. So I think a lot of the topics and things that we're going to talk about today really apply to a variety of company sizes and configurations. And so let's just dive right in. So I think one of the big factors that you need to keep in mind, and really in my mind, the biggest factor that helps sort of guide the decision on, should I use offshore resources? Should I use onshore resources? Should I use a blend? What should that blend looks like? The biggest factor there, I really think, comes down to what stage are you at with the product life cycle. And depending on what stage you're at or where you are in that journey is really going to be a heavy influence on staffing it with a variety of different resource options and locations. And so I thought it would be a great place to start by let's talk about sort of the main three stages that I would sort of break these down into. And then we're going to go into more detail about, well, what does it look like for those various stages and what kinds of things to keep in mind and approaches that might make sense for each of those stages. So the first one that we labeled here is what we would sort of call the vision or the design or the sort of the creative planning stage. Think of this as this concept. This is, we are thinking we should build something. Right? This could be an internal tool. This could be an external facing tool. It could be something as a part of a company that does a lot of different, offers a lot of different products or services. Or this could be in a startup scenario where you're going to start up a software company and this is the product. This is the company, right? But regardless of what situation those are, you're going to start with some sort of a concept phase. And so then the next stage beyond that is what I've sort of dubbed like the V1 development stage. This is, we've done the work up front to plan and get clear on what we need to build. And now we're actually going to build something. This is going to be our V1. At N08, we sort of refer to this as sort of the MLP, like the minimum lovable product stage. We're trying to build something that is the minimum lovable for those users that are going to use this product that we can launch with. And I do a whole talk on just why that's important and how that reduces risk and that kind of thing. So if you're interested in that, reach out and we can give you some other resources on that element of it. And then sort of the third stage that I've broken out here is what I would call ongoing product development. So this is, we've launched the product, we've gotten validation. We're going to assume at this point, if we're still investing in it, is that it's successful and it's adding value. It's accomplishing whatever you set out to accomplish when you started creating it. But you're in the ongoing product development. You're adding features, you're fixing things, you're making improvements, you're learning, and it's an ongoing effort, right? And so a lot of what I'm talking about today is really aimed at more of a US audience. Some of the recommendations that I'll make, some of the tactics that I'll talk about are aimed at that situation. So if you are in another part of the world, let's say that you're in India, some of the things that I'm going to talk about today may not quite fit that scenario, right? The principles still stay the same, but I'll talk about it in a couple minutes, how that may be slightly different if you're in a different area. So just keep in mind that generally speaking, what I'm talking about is mainly aimed at a North America or US scenario, right? And so these are the high level stages. Products will kind of ebb and flow through these, but in terms of sort of the broad high level, these are the different buckets that I think will impact the most. And then the other thing that I would like you to keep in mind is I'm talking about relatively small to medium sized product teams. So think, 10 to 15 people in total. I still think the underlying principles of what we'll talk about will still apply to much larger teams, but that playbook would be slightly modified in the scenarios where you got really large teams. So let's talk about so how do we leverage onshore and offshore resources at each stage? And what I'm going to do here, I'm going to toggle back and forth because I want to kind of refresh what stages we're talking about. But so how do we decide based on what stage we're in, what's the right way to resource these things? So if I go back to this slide and we look at those different stages, I'm going to start the first one. This is sort of the vision, design, creative part of the process. And my sort of default recommendation here is that during this phase, you'll want to be almost entirely onshore, right? And the reason why, there's a few different reasons why. One is that this is involving a more abstract part of the process. It's a very creative part of the process. This is oftentimes where a lot of the sort of underlying business case for these products would be defined. And it's also where a lot of the decisions are getting made on what exactly is it that we're going to build? How are we going to build it? What technology are we going to use? How are we going to break up the roadmap? What's our path to creating this and launching it? And a lot of the design work that's done here, which will be sort of both technical design and both visual design, user experience design, is going to be handled in this stage. And this isn't to say that offshore resources can't do that stuff. It's just that we're talking about optimization. So if you're building a product that's primarily aimed at a US audience, that context that comes with, the nuances around how users will use this, what they're going to find valuable, what's going to be important to them, what's going to be a expected user experience, all those kinds of things are super important at this part. And not that it can't be done by an offshore team at this stage, it's just there's another hurdle, an extra hurdle level there that's really challenging. The other thing about this is if you are a US company and you're working on a product, right, that leadership and that product management element of it is very likely US based. And so the collaboration among the different resources and roles that are going to be involved at this point, being in the same time zone, you'll see a much quicker collaboration. And so you'll move more efficiently. So I would argue that staffing with an all onshore team during this phase actually turns out to be more cost effective because there's not as much of a need for process and sort of more the overhead of managing that stage. It's more creative in nature, it's more collaborative in nature. And so stage one or that vision stage generally would be mostly onshore. The exception would be, what we found over time is that while you would staff this with mainly an onshore option, if you feel that there's a very high likelihood you're going to move to development, and that development approach is going to involve an offshore team, it is a good idea to have someone from that offshore team involved during this stage. So like what we will do is we will have at the minimum usually a scrum master or a project manager involved even during this phase, but they typically wouldn't have a lot of responsibilities towards sort of the artifacts that we're creating at that point. What we're trying to do is have them involved in sort of the discussions, the logic behind the decisions that are made, and understanding that sort of full context of what we're designing, so that when you do go to development and you do begin to use offshore resources for that stage, then there's a little bit of a smoother handoff there, right? And so sort of just to summarize, this would mainly be an onshore team. What this could include would be, you definitely have to have product ownership. So whether that's in-house or that's part of a partner team or a vendor that you're using, that's one of the most critical roles at this stage. They've got to be the final say on what's going to be built, how it's going to look. They're doing all the approvals. Usually you would have a design strategist or someone covering that product strategy, UX strategy role. You would also have some sort of a solution architect role covered here. So someone to help make decisions on what's the right target platform for this, what's the tech stack, what kind of an architecture approach are we going to use, what kind of third-party integrations are we going to need to plan for. Even judging technical feasibility is really important at this stage, right? So is what we're wanting to do even technically feasible at this point? Oftentimes, you might even do some light prototyping or proof of concept work during that stage as well. And that person would either do that on their own, or they would sort of lead that maybe with some additional resources. So others that would be included there would be, it's not uncommon to need sort of a project coordinator at this point, just to kind of keep things on track. And you will also potentially have a need for someone more of like a BA or a business analyst to help sort of document sort of the requirements and some of the details that you're pulling out during this stage, right? So this is primarily all onshore. This is some involvement maybe from an offshore resource if you're pretty clear that you're going to use that at the next stage. So then if we move to the next stage, this V1 development stage, you have a choice to make. Am I going to continue to do all of this work with an onshore team, or would I do this with an all offshore team, or is this an appropriate point where we can use a blend, right? I'm going to speak really generally. I think it is doable to use a blend at this point. And it can actually be really beneficial to use a blend at this point, especially if a lot of the pressure is from budget, right? But you got to set it up right. Where people tend to make a mistake is they think that they can kind of throw things over the fence to an offshore team, and it's going to come back exactly the way that they want. And that's really difficult to execute on, especially if you don't have a lot of experience on your team that knows and has worked with offshore teams extensively, and you don't have a lot of defined process in place already. That gets really, really hard. So what I've seen work really well when you decide to do this with more of a blended option is that you try to pull forward involvement from those people who were involved in that creative stage into the V1 development stage. So think that solution architect that I talked about a few minutes ago, having them stay involved in the team, right? They're involved throughout the V1 process. That design strategist who very much covers a lot of product related kind of stuff, they would stay involved. Like, and I mean involved, I mean on daily stand-ups, helping to groom backlogs, they're like involved, right? The product owner, of course, no matter what option, whether you're all onshore, all offshore, a blend of both, they have to be involved no matter what. And that person typically is going to be a US resource in the example that we're talking about today. So back to V1 development. So if you've done the proper planning work in sort of the creative stage, hopefully by this point, you've got a design prototype, at least for all the major core flows of the application. You've got clarity around scope on the V1 launch. What are we going to build? What are we not going to build during that phase? You've got your big technical questions answered. So you know what's the technology we're using, what's the platforms we're using, what type of integrations, what type of infrastructure we're going to need. So you've got clarity around those kinds of things, and now you're ready to build it. So if you've got the solution architect, got a design strategist, you've got the product owner, you're set up pretty well to probably start leveraging an offshore team. And this is going to help you with that cost equation. So you're not completely getting away from US resources, right? Which is going to be a much higher cost profile than using offshore. But this blend is going to help you to make sure that the major decision-making, the design, the review, the big planning elements that could make or break a product are covered by your US team. And then you're going to scale and begin to get more cost effective by marrying that with an offshore team. So what would the rest of the team look like? So if you've got a architect, if you've got a design strategist who, I'm in my example here, I'm assuming that person is also doing visual design. Sometimes that role will be split. You'll have a visual designer, you'll have a more of a UX strategist, right? But oftentimes that can be the same person. And you've got your product owner. So on the offshore side, and I'm going to use India. There's a lot of other options for offshore, but in a very typical example of US combined with an India team, you would marry that with developers across your different technologies, and QA often can be a part of that team as well. Another one that's going to be important is if you find the need to specifically have DevOps, that could probably go on either side. You could use that as a US resource or an offshore resource. But the key thing to keep in mind here is this early in the product lifecycle, you probably don't need a full-time DevOps resource. So you'll have flexibility. And so because you have that flexibility and you don't have this need for like 40 hours a week from that type of a resource, maybe using that as a US resource in the beginning would be a good move. But I'm not opposed to using that as an offshore role as well at this stage. Another thing to keep in mind around DevOps is that a lot of times what we'll see is that the solution architect that's involved up through this point, very frequently they have that capability to do the DevOps work that's needed at this stage. And so how many developers do we need? A lot of that's going to determine how many different towers or stacks that we're having to support. So in an example where you're building sort of a full platform solution where there is a back end, there's some sort of a front end web application, maybe it's user facing, maybe it's more of an admin application. And let's say that you also have the need for mobile apps, whether those are native or they're using some kind of cross-platform technology. The example would be the same. But I'm going to take a really simple scenario. Let's say that you got to have a native iOS app. You need a native Android app. You need a web application for the users, and you need a web admin console and the back end. Right. So at a minimum, the very, very minimum, you probably are going to be looking at 3 different developers, probably more. Right. So the reason why I say 3, but we're talking about really kind of 5 different towers, is that it's possible to use a full stack developer that could handle the back end and do some of that front end work. But what's probably going to happen there is you're going to be bottlenecked because there's a lot of web development to be done. So what I would do in that scenario is I would maybe do a front end web developer, a back end web developer. If you can swing it, maybe it makes sense to have 2 front end developers because there's sort of 2 different web experiences. And then you would need an iOS like native developer and an Android native developer in most scenarios. And then along with that, you would need a QA resource. And so this function of how much QA do I need for each resource, we can talk a lot about that, but I'm going to try to keep this a little more high level today. But those roles, I think that all of that could be an offshore team. if you marry it with the involvement from the solution architect in the US. Another way that you could potentially staff that same scenario, if your budget can swing it, is move the backend developer to the US side, right? Because a lot of the complexity, and I've seen more projects get killed by backend problems than front end problems, is move that backend developer to the US team. And then you could do the front end development on web, the iOS app and the Android app and the testing with an offshore team. And that would be a pretty good bang for your buck in terms of shifting it from an offshore resource to an onshore resource, right? In that scenario, it would be a good idea to try to find a backend developer in the US that is able to help do code reviews and coaching with the team and helping to align with the solution architect to make sure that the way that we're actually building things aligns with the architecture plan. So if those folks are really well aligned and in tune, then that's going to help make sure that they're able to help make sure that everyone's following that plan, right? So just to sort of recap that at a real high level, you'd have a product owner in the US, you'd have a designer or a strategist, UX strategist in the US, you have solutions architect in the US. That role, both of those roles, in fact, could be partial. They wouldn't need to be dedicated at this point. And then you would do a back end or a full stack dev either in the US or India, and then front end in India, iOS in India, Android in India, QA in India, right? In my mind, for V1 on a sort of multi-platform V1 that you're building, that's a super optimized team. The one other role that I didn't talk about there is the project manager, the scrum master. You're definitely going to want to have that. And I think at this stage of the game, that could go to the offshore team also, right? Because you can get more hours out of it for your budget. And they're going to be able to help more adequately cover a lot of the really key things that we're going to talk about here in just a couple minutes. So that would be staffing at the stage 2. Now I'm going to flip forward here. See, we talked a little bit about onshore, offshore, and which roles. So hopefully that gives you a little bit clarity for that. Let's talk about the ongoing product development stage. So if we go back over to our original slide here with the main stages, we talked about the stage 1 or the creative stage. We talked about the V1 development. Now let's talk a little bit about ongoing product development. So what does that even mean? That means once you've launched the product, you've gotten your validation, you're sort of more in a steady state. Things that become more important at this stage is being really steady, having solid processes in place, having sort of a way of doing things, a rhythm associated to how you do things becomes way more important at this stage. And you really have the flexibility now to start toying with how do you morph some of your staffing to become even more cost effective. So a couple of things will happen here. One is you may decide I need more capacity, right? So the bigger the team, the more you need to look at how do I divide this up? Again, in our example, assuming that we're talking about a team that's no bigger than 10 to 15 people total, you can continue to start to add heavier resourcing to your offshore team, right? If you start to get much bigger than that, what I've seen be really successful is you pull sort of a core team to the US side. A lot of people call it like a governance pod. And so they will focus on certain development activities and be fully functioning, be a fully functioning development team, all US side. And then what that does is it helps you to scale much bigger with the offshore resources while still maintaining control and efficiency. Right. So I'm not going to go too far into that, but if you're interested in it, go ahead and throw it into the question window and we can talk about that at the end. We have some other resources we can provide to for bigger teams. But once you get into ongoing product development, what are some of the big questions you're going to have to ask yourself? One of the big challenges early in a product lifecycle is production support, like live production support. So once you have a live application, the game changes a little bit because you have real users and it becomes more critical that the environments are really stable, right? So if you have a production outage, that's a really big deal if you've got thousands of people using it every day. So you have to have a plan for how are you going to cover that. And sometimes if you are all offshore at this point, that becomes a big challenge. So how do you approach that? There's a couple different ways. One is it's a little bit, this option's a little bit harder to find and to make it work, but it's totally doable, is you can find a sort of partial or freelance type of resource in the US that is actively working as a part of that ongoing product development, right? And it can't be like a front end developer. It needs to be someone who has a pretty good feel for the back end, for the infrastructure. They touch some of the DevOps type of things related to the product. But again, if they're full stack, you could address some front end things and back end things. But in my experience, most production level issues, especially things that are more of an emergency, they're very frequently back end related. It's much more rare that they're going to be front end related. So I would tilt heavier towards more of a back end resource that could be maybe fractionally allocated, but consistently allocated. And what I mean by that is it can't be somebody that you just kind of use them here and there whenever there's a fire. It's really important that they are consistently involved. So they already know what's going on and they can triage things quickly. They know the different players on the team. They can potentially resolve issues themselves during US business hours, and then coordinate with the offshore team as needed after they sort of get involved, right? So a fractional backend resource would be sort of the optimal in terms of being able to respond to those production outages, even during US time, and cost. If that's not a possibility, right, which especially for early stage startups, that's still pretty hard to swing, right? Because it's a big chunk of their budget this early in the game. Then make sure that you have a pretty good overlap with your India team. And so at least you can extend your coverage window into the day, and just know that your real risk is going to be the late part of the day, US hours, right? So that's going to leave a gap. The other option that I have seen work, again, is maybe it may take a little bit more work to find the right person and get it in place, is you could potentially pay a premium and you could have a offshore resource that works a flipped schedule. So they work night times in India, so they're working during the daytime, right? And oftentimes to get the right type of person to take on that type of schedule, it may cost a little bit more. And so that's certainly an option. In fact, that's probably more cost effective. And if I was going to go that route, I would make that a dedicated resource. They just work a shifted schedule. They work as part of the team. They overlap with the rest of the resources in the India time zone, but they extend that production support window where you've got real good coverage kind of throughout the US business hours. So if you wanted to go to, if you think about like a scale, right? On one end of the scale is going to be the most cost effective, probably highest risk. On the other side, you have the lowest risk, but lowest cost effectiveness, right? You would staff your ongoing product team with all US resources on this end, all offshore resources on that end. What we're trying to do is strike the right balance based on the product's needs where you are right now in the life cycle. And so if you wanted to go all the way to the one end where it's as cost effective as it can possibly be, what you're going to need is you're going to need enough to support your sort of production support needs, but also your ongoing product development needs. So you have to consider, what's my roadmap and how much active development am I doing? So if we assume we're doing a lot of active development, then you're going to need, additional resources. You may need the same team that you had in V1, or maybe even a bigger team than what you had in V1 if you're starting to ramp up your feature development, right? So if you're wanting to go faster, you're going to have to add more bandwidth to that. The product management still would stay onshore. I would still encourage you to have a design strategist, at least periodically involved, maybe involved in sprint demos and reviewing designs, that kind of thing, and the solution architect, right? So a lot of what we talked about in that stage one could carry over into ongoing product development. One other scenario in ongoing product development that I'll talk about is is probably not really ongoing product development. It's probably more in the bucket of maintenance. And the distinction there is that maintenance is really just keeping the lights on. It's making sure that we have the capability to respond if there's an urgent issue. And this is like production interruption type of issues, right? So if that's the case, you could probably work out arrangements where you have fractionally allocated resources offshore that may not be working on it dedicatedly, but lots of companies out there offer that. I know that NO8 offers that. I think ISHIR offers that, where you have sort of a fractional team where you pay, you may not need them, but they keep the lights on. They're doing monitoring, they're available, there's a process in place, there's people that are knowledgeable with the product, and that can be offshore in the early days of the product as well, until your needs sort of ramp up. Does that make sense so far? If anybody have any questions, y'all, just a reminder to throw those into the window. I'd love to hear from you guys. And if there's things that are sort of related to this topic you'd like me to go a little bit deeper on, feel free to drop that in there too. While we're waiting on any questions to come in, I'm going to jump to kind of some tips. So one of the most important things about using any sort of blended team is it's really important that someone involved has a lot of experience working with onshore, offshore teams, or all offshore teams. If you don't have anyone on the team that has experience doing that, I can promise you it is going to be a disaster. And so you have to have somebody that's got a lot of experience doing that. That would be the first tip. Other things that I think you have to keep in mind is that because of the time zone differences, communication is just harder. So what I like to make sure that we have is we have a very consistent communication cadence, right? And one of the best mechanisms to do that is your daily stand-up. So we tend to run Scrum at NO8. I think ISHIR does that as well. I mean, it's pretty mainstream at this point, but it's important to follow those ceremonies, and the daily stand-up is one of the key elements of that. It's every day being able to check in with the team. And it's really important. This gets lost a lot of times, is it's really important is if there's anybody that is involved with that product team, they need to be on that stand-up on most days, right? It gets really hard to move things along really fast if there's people who are not on the stand-up and they're, emailing or sending in their updates in another way each day, because you just can't close the loop on communication. You'll talk about it there on the stand-up, and then somebody's got to go coordinate with them and come back again the next day. And there's just a lot of energy and time lost that way. The other thing that I would encourage you to do is make sure that you have a really strong process in place, and sort of ceremonies and process go hand in hand. So if we talk about like, what are those main process steps that you should have in place at a minimum? I already talked about the daily stand-up. That's starting point. That's a must-have. Next would be that you've got a regular backlog grooming. And so a tip there would be make sure it's a recurring meeting that's already on the calendar, and you're not trying to figure out when to do that. Because if you're having to ad hoc schedule that every time, you're gonna miss those, and you're gonna skip them, and they won't get done, and you'll start to get behind. So the backlog grooming, the sprint planning, making sure that as part of the sprint planning, your product owner is signing off on every sprint. And then making sure that you're following these steps, like even down to sprints. One of the mistakes that you would see happen way more than you think is that sprints don't start and stop consistently. And so as you're trying to be steady and you're trying to stay smooth in your process, you got to make sure that you're sort of following your process pretty religiously. And so part of that is making sure you start and you stop sprints on time every time. Why? Well, you have no way to measure how well your team's doing and keeping an eye on how things are progressing if you don't have consistency in those intervals. But if you start and stop your sprint at the same time every sprint, you can start to look at the data and the results from those and understand, are we on track? Or are we off track? Same thing with a daily stand-up. The reason why that's so important is you got to make sure that day by day you're checking in. Hey, we planned all this stuff for this sprint. Are we on track or are we off track? Another thing that's particularly important when working with an offshore team, or any team for that matter, but it's especially important when you're in different time zones, is making sure that you're doing the sprint demos with the product owner. So after you've completed something at the end of the sprint, making sure that the product owner, and I would encourage the design strategist who help sort of think through all of these user experiences, they're involved with it as well, are part of the sprint review demos, because they're going to actually see working software. And if there's any divergence there in terms of what was intended and then what's actually getting built, that's a great place to plug that gap before it gets too far down the road. So process is crucial. The other thing that is really important is that and I see this plague offshore teams all the time, is if planning is not being done properly and well enough. And so what do I mean by that? That's things like grooming the backlog, making sure that all the tickets are clear. They've got acceptance criteria. They've got enough detail that the developer knows what they need to do and how it will pass. That all of the dependencies for that ticket have been resolved. So they've got everything that they need. That would include things like access to things, even design artifacts. All that stuff is a part of what we want to make sure is set up. And so ideally, you would have at least a couple of sprints sort of in the backlog, groomed, planned, estimated, ready to go. And the better you plan, the better quality of what that backlog looks like before you actually start the sprint, the way better productivity and quality you're going to get out of the offshore team.